One thing Bugatti didn't think we were able to do is separate the front end of the car from the rear.
Bugatti just rejected Mat Armstrong. Again, after months of blood, sweat, and millions of views spent resurrecting a wrecked Chiron, the factory just sent a clear message: you're not one of us. But Bugatti might have played their hand too early. That rejection has sparked a firestorm that reached the halls of European Parliament. Regulators are now asking if Bugatti has the right to brick a mechanical marvel. This isn't just a YouTube drama anymore. It's a legal showdown that could change the future of car ownership forever. The $6 million wreck. Let's go back to where this whole thing started. To understand why Europe is now involved, you need to know exactly what Mat Armstrong walked into, and why Bugatti's reaction to it changed everything.
So the car would have to be on site with ourselves, that new part would get ordered, you see.
There's no way I'm taking that. I didn't buy this.
October 2025, Miami, Florida. A 25-year-old millionaire named Alex Gonzalez owns one of the most exclusive cars on the planet, a Bugatti Chiron Pur Sport. Only 60 of them were ever made. Ever. In the entire world. And Alex had been the proud owner of his for exactly 2 months when it happened. He hadn't even finished paying it off. The monthly payments alone were coming in at around $86,000 a month. Then the car got wrecked. The details of exactly how it happened don't matter as much as what the car looked like afterward. The front end was completely gone. Crumpled carbon fiber, deployed airbags, destroyed headlights. The iconic Bugatti horseshoe grille, crushed. Frame damage. And because only 60 of these cars exist, replacement parts aren't sitting on a shelf somewhere. They have to come directly from Bugatti's factory in Mulsanne, France. Insurance came in and took one look at the repair estimate. $1.7 million in parts alone. They declared it a total loss, slapped it with a salvage title, and sent it straight to a Copart auction. The world was now officially down to 59 drivable Chiron Pur Sport. That is where Mat Armstrong heard about it. Now, if you don't know who Mat Armstrong is, here is what you need to understand quickly. He is a British mechanic and YouTuber who has built his entire reputation on one thing: taking cars that the world has given up on and bringing them back from the dead. Lamborghinis, Ferraris, McLarens. He has done it over and over again in front of millions of people, not in a Bugatti factory, not with a team of factory-trained engineers and unlimited budgets. In his own workshop with his own hands on camera for the world to watch. So when he heard about a $6 million Bugatti sitting in a Miami auction lot with a salvage title, he did not hesitate. He booked a last-minute transatlantic flight, and here is where the chaos starts, because Mat Armstrong cannot do anything simply. On the way to the workshop to inspect the Chiron for the first time, a Chevrolet cut across 4 lanes of Miami traffic and slammed directly into a Ferrari being driven by one of his crew members. So by the time Matt and his team finally arrived to look at one extremely expensive wrecked car, they had 2 waiting for them. But none of that mattered once he saw the Chiron in person. He described it as looking even worse than it did in the photos. The crumple at the front was serious, the airbags had blown, the entire nose section needed replacement. And when he started running numbers on what it would actually take to bring this car back, the figure that kept coming up was enormous. Alex, the original owner, had already bought the car back from the insurance auction himself. He paid $1,600,000 for a car the insurer had written off. And now he was asking Matt to rebuild it because Bugatti had quoted him $1.7 million just for the parts. Not the labor, not the shipping, not anything else, just the components. Alex looked at that quote and called Matt instead, and Matt said yes. But there was a problem. A very specific, very deliberate problem that Bugatti had already put in place. And this is where the story stops being about a crashed car and starts being about something far bigger. Because here's the question that nobody in the automotive world had really asked out loud before this moment. If you legally own a car, can the manufacturer stop you from fixing it? Bugatti had already answered that question. They had locked the vehicle identification number, the VIN, of this specific Chiron. What that means in practice is devastating in its simplicity. Every authorized Bugatti dealer in the world had been blocked from selling a single part for this car, not because the part didn't exist, not because it wasn't available, because Bugatti had made a deliberate decision to make sure that no one outside of their own factory could ever touch this rebuild. The only option Bugatti offered was to send the car to Mulsanne, France for factory repair at Bugatti prices, which, as the $1.7 million quote had already made very clear, would cost nearly as much as buying another Chiron outright. Mat Armstrong stood in that Miami workshop, looked at the wrecked Chiron in front of him, and made a decision. he was going to rebuild it anyway.
We can't give you the parts, but we'll take that car, we'll take it to Croatia or France, wherever they're going to do it.
And that decision set off a chain of events that no one, not Matt, not Bugatti, not the car community, and certainly not the European Union, could have fully predicted. But before we get to Europe, and before we get to the law that is about to turn Bugatti's entire business model on its head, there is one more layer to this story that most people missed. Because Bugatti did not stay silent. Their CEO stepped in personally. And what he said publicly was very different from what was apparently happening behind closed doors. The CEO who watched from the shadows here is something that most people glossed over when the story first broke. The CEO of Bugatti, one of the most exclusive car brands on the planet, was sitting at home watching a YouTuber's rebuild videos. Not just watching, he was taking notes.
CEO of Bugatti has explained why he will not be selling replacement Chiron parts to Mat Armstrong.
Mat Rimac is not your typical luxury car executive. He is a Croatian entrepreneur who built his own electric hypercar company from scratch before Porsche and Volkswagen came knocking, and he eventually ran Bugatti as part of the Rimac group. He is sharp, he is media savvy, and he clearly understood that Mat Armstrong's videos were reaching an audience that Bugatti's own marketing could never touch. Millions of people who would never afford a Chiron were watching every single episode of this rebuild with the intensity of a sports final. And the story being told in those videos was not flattering to Bugatti. So Rimac did something unexpected. He made a video of his own. He posted it to Instagram, addressing the situation directly, and what he said was carefully constructed. He pushed back on the parts prices Armstrong had been quoting in his videos, saying the figures circulating online were incorrect and inflated. He walked through the actual costs of individual components, trying to reframe the narrative around Bugatti's pricing. He also made it very clear that the complexity of this particular rebuild was not something any independent mechanic, however talented, should be attempting alone, pointing out that to access the damaged transmission, the car essentially needed to be split in half, and that only 2 facilities in the entire world were equipped to do that safely. And then he offered Armstrong an olive branch. He said the car was welcome at the Molsheim factory if Armstrong wanted to fly it over for a proper assessment and repair.
He explained that there is a certain weak point in the dash that the airbag is able to poke through and explode properly.
On the surface, it sounded reasonable, but Mat Armstrong heard something else entirely in that offer, and he said so publicly. He pointed out that flying a salvage titled Structurally Compromised Bugatti from Miami to France and handing it over to the manufacturer, who had already quoted $1.7 million to fix it, was not a solution. It was a redirection, a polite way of saying, come back to us and pay our price. He was not prepared to do that, and he said so plainly, adding that it was, in his own words, absolutely mental that the CEO of Bugatti was even watching his videos at all, let alone making response content about them. But here is what made Armstrong suspicious, and what he revealed later in a candid interview on the Cars and Money podcast hosted by Rob Moore and Carl Hartley. He said he believed Rimac personally may have been open to finding a solution, but that someone else inside the Bugatti corporate structure had overruled him. He described noticing a shift in Rimac's tone over the course of their exchanges, a change he felt did not come from Rimac himself, but from above or around him, from the corporate machinery that surrounds any brand at that level. I do think there is someone else behind his words, Armstrong said, because I do think it's strange how the tone has changed. It was a careful thing to say, and a revealing one because it suggested that the public back and forth between Armstrong and Rimac was only the visible surface of a much more complicated internal conversation happening inside Bugatti's walls. Carl Hartley, one of the podcast hosts, offered Bugatti's perspective as best he could. He put forward the argument that a brand like Bugatti operates at the absolute pinnacle of the automotive world precisely because of the control it maintains over every aspect of its cars, and that allowing an independent rebuild to proceed posed a brand risk that extended far beyond a single vehicle. His hypothetical was blunt. If Armstrong's repairs were not up to the required standard and something went wrong on the road, the headline would not read, "YouTuber's rebuild fails." It would read, "Bugatti crashes and injures family of 4. And that, Hartley argued, was simply not a risk a manufacturer at Bugatti's level could absorb. Armstrong acknowledged the argument. He understood the logic, but he pushed back on the conclusion, asking a question that cut to the heart of the matter. If Bugatti does not want anyone outside its network touching its cars, why are those cars allowed to be auctioned off on salvage platforms like Copart in the first place? Why does the car leave the factory without any enforceable restriction on what happens to it after a total loss? And why, he asked, was Bugatti's answer to every version of this question the same? send it to France, and pay whatever we say. Nobody at Bugatti gave a direct answer to that, and the silence, as it turned out, was about to become very expensive for them, because the same question Mat Armstrong was asking in a podcast studio in England was starting to be asked in a very different kind of room, in Brussels. When one man's fight becomes everybody's problem.
Do I agree with how Mate or Bugatti as a brand?
Here is the thing about the Mat Armstrong and Bugatti story. The car community understood it immediately, but the wider world was slower to catch up. This was never really just about one crashed Chiron in Miami. It was about a principle that touched every single person who had ever bought something expensive and then been told by the company that made it that they had no right to fix it themselves. And that principle had been building toward a legal reckoning for years before Mat Armstrong ever booked that flight to Miami. To understand what Europe stepped into and why, you have to understand what the right to repair movement actually is, because it did not start with cars, and it did not start with Bugatti. It started with farmers in the United States buying John Deere tractors worth hundreds of thousands of dollars, only to discover that when something broke in the field, they could not fix it themselves because the software that ran the tractor was locked behind the manufacturer's wall. It started with people buying smartphones and being told that opening the back panel would void the warranty entirely. It started with hospitals during the early days of the pandemic, realizing that ventilators had proprietary parts that could not be sourced or repaired without the manufacturer's direct involvement, and that people were dying in part because of that restriction. The pattern was the same everywhere you looked. A manufacturer sells you a product and then quietly retains permanent control over what happens to that product for the rest of its life, regardless of who legally owns it. The European Union had been watching this pattern for years, and by June 2024, they had seen enough. The EU formally adopted Directive 2024/1799, better known simply as the Right to Repair Directive, and its core message was straightforward and deliberately uncomfortable for manufacturers to hear. Consumers have the right to repair the things they own, and manufacturers do not get to use proprietary systems, locked parts networks, or technical barriers to take that right away from them. Every EU member state was given until the 31st of July, 2026 to write this directive into national law, and from that date forward, the old way of doing things would no longer be legally defensible. The timing, when you place it next to the Mat Armstrong saga, is striking. The directive had already been signed and was moving through implementation across Europe when Armstrong flew to Miami, when Bugatti locked the VI in, when Rimac posted his Instagram video, and when the entire story exploded across automotive media worldwide. The legal framework that would eventually make Bugatti's position untenable was already in motion before most people had ever heard of Alex Gonzalez or his crashed Pur Sport. And yet the Armstrong story became the most visible and human face of exactly the problem the directive was designed to solve. Germany moved in January 2026 when the Federal Ministry of Justice and Consumer Protection published a draft bill to bring the directive into German law with explicit new obligations requiring manufacturers to make spare parts and repair information available to independent repairers at fair prices and within reasonable timeframes. France, where Bugatti's factory sits in the town of Molsheim in the Alsace region, was working through its own transposition process. Country by country, the legal walls that brands like Bugatti had spent years quietly building around their products were beginning to come down, one national parliament at a time. But here is the detail that matters most, and it is the one that automotive journalists kept circling back to when they wrote about this story in the months that followed. The Right to Repair Directive, in its current form, lists specific product categories in its Annex 2, washing machines, dishwashers, smartphones, tablets, and similar consumer electronics. Luxury hypercars are not on that list. Vehicles, in the formal legal sense, fall outside the directive's current product scope, which means that technically, in a strict reading of the law as it stands, Bugatti could argue that none of this applies to them directly. And yet the pressure on Bugatti was real, documented, and growing, because the directive's broader principles, the idea that manufacturers cannot use technical barriers to monopolize repair, were already influencing regulatory conversations well beyond the product categories named in Annex 2. Consumer protection bodies across Europe were looking at the automotive sector specifically, and the Armstrong case had given those conversations a name, a face, and a YouTube channel with tens of millions of views providing real-time evidence. The question was no longer whether the law would eventually reach the car industry. It was only a matter of when, and whether Bugatti would be ready for it when it did. Because what Mat Armstrong did next in his workshop proved something that Bugatti had publicly insisted was impossible, and that proof was about to make their entire argument look very fragile indeed. The rebuild Bugatti said could never happen. Bugatti had made one thing very clear from the beginning. This car could not be rebuilt outside of their factory, not by an independent mechanic, not without their parts, not without their engineers, their specialized equipment, and their controlled environment in Molsheim. Mate Rimac had said it plainly in his Instagram video, and the technical argument behind it was not entirely without merit. The Chiron Pur Sport is not a normal car, and the damage it had sustained was not normal. But Mat Armstrong had heard that kind of language before about other cars from other manufacturers, and he had proven it wrong every single time. So he got to work. The first major obstacle was not the crumpled carbon fiber at the front, nor the missing headlights, nor the destroyed grille, nor even the deployed airbags. It was the transmission, and this was where Remac's warning carried the most specific weight.
We're nearly there. Almost.
Cool. Give me 20 minutes.
20 minutes of Bob welding.
The gearbox had sustained serious damage in the crash, and to access it properly, the entire car needed to be physically split, the front section separated from the rear, a procedure that Rimac had publicly stated could only be performed in 2 places in the world. The implication was obvious. Without factory intervention, the transmission was unreachable, and without it, the car was permanently grounded. Armstrong and his team studied the car's architecture, consulted every available resource, and then did something that made the automotive community sit up and take notice. They removed a series of bolts from the modular structure of the Chiron and separated the car themselves, cleanly and without factory equipment, accessing the transmission in a way that Remac's statement had suggested was simply not possible outside a specialist facility. It was one of those moments that the videos captured perfectly. The quiet focus, the careful work, and then the realization spreading across the team that they had just done the thing they had been told could not be done. Rimac, as it later emerged, had been watching that video too. With the transmission accessible, the rebuild began in earnest, and what followed over the subsequent weeks and months was a masterclass in problem solving under the most difficult conditions imaginable. Because Bugatti's locked VIN meant that every single part that was needed had to be sourced through alternative channels or fabricated entirely from scratch. The airbags were sourced from an Audi A3, cross-referenced against the Chiron systems, and adapted to fit. A solution that sounds improvised until you understand the engineering logic behind it and realize it was anything but. Custom radiators were built by hand to replace the originals destroyed in the crash, engineered specifically to meet the cooling demands of a 16-cylinder, 1,500 horsepower engine that does not forgive mistakes. The coolant system, the fuel system, the intercooler setup, and the ECU had all been disrupted by the crash and had to be brought back into alignment together. Because on a car this complex, nothing works in isolation, and a failure in one system cascades immediately into every system connected to it. There were scares along the way. Viewers watching the rebuild videos spotted what appeared to be a hairline crack in the chassis structure and raised the alarm in the comments, and for a moment the fear was real. Hairline cracks in carbon fiber monocoques are not cosmetic issues, they are structural ones. And on a car capable of the speeds the Chiron is built for, a compromised chassis is not something anyone walks away from. Armstrong's team investigated thoroughly and confirmed that the crack viewers had seen was not structural damage, but a visual artifact caused by the camera angle and lighting. The relief that followed was visible in the video, the kind of unscripted human reaction that no amount of production polish can manufacture. And then came the moment that the entire rebuild had been building toward. The moment that Bugatti had said would never arrive. The team reconnected the systems, checked everything one final time, and Armstrong started the engine. The Chiron fired. That 16-cylinder engine, the same one Bugatti had insisted could only be properly managed inside their own factory, came to life in an independent workshop rebuilt by a mechanic who had been refused every official part he asked for, and it ran. Not perfectly, not without remaining work still to do, but it ran, and the sound of it was the loudest possible answer to every statement Bugatti had made about what was and was not possible outside of Molsheim. The comment section on that video went into frenzy. And somewhere in France, in a factory town in the Alsace region, the people who had insisted this moment would never come had some very uncomfortable thinking to do, because the Veyron sitting in Armstrong's workshop was already waiting, and that second rejection was about to make the first one look minor by comparison. The Veyron, the second door, and the wall that wouldn't move. You would think that after everything with the Chiron, the locked VIN, the CEO's public response, the rebuild that wasn't supposed to be possible, Bugatti would have quietly decided that Mat Armstrong was not a fight worth continuing, that the smartest move for a brand of their stature was to let the story fade and move on. But that is not what happened, and the reason it did not is everything you need to know about how deeply embedded Bugatti's control policy is in the company's identity. While the Chiron rebuild was still underway, Armstrong acquired another Bugatti entirely. This one was a Veyron, the predecessor to the Chiron, the car that, when it first launched in 2005, genuinely changed what people believed a road car could do, with a top speed of over 250 miles per hour and a price tag that made most supercars look modest. The specific Veyron Armstrong acquired had been repossessed, coming with its own mechanical complications waiting to be uncovered, and Armstrong, being Armstrong, saw it as exactly the kind of challenge his audience had come to expect from him. The issues revealed themselves quickly. A no-gear fault turned out to be a blown fuse, which was almost comically simple given the car's reputation, but that relief evaporated fast when the team found a misfiring engine, a leaking radiator, and a fuse box fault that needed proper diagnosis before anyone could be confident about what else was hiding underneath. Armstrong worked through each problem methodically, and for a while this project looked like it might move more smoothly than the Chiron. No crash damage, no crumpled bodywork, no destroyed front end to deal with. And then he called Bugatti. He had a straightforward question. Could they supply the service parts he needed? He was not asking for anything unusual, just standard components that wear out in the normal course of a car's life. He had taken full public responsibility for the Chiron project and approached this call with what seemed like a reasonable expectation that a second project might be handled differently, that perhaps things had shifted after everything that had played out so publicly the first time. Bugatti said no again. The answer was identical to before and rooted in the same policy. Parts would not be supplied to anyone outside their authorized network, and the Veyron would need to be physically on site with the company before any transaction could happen. Armstrong discovered through this process that a legal framework underpinned the entire refusal, a structure that allowed Bugatti to use their authorized dealer network as a gate through which all parts and service had to pass, quietly locking out independent mechanics as a matter of company-wide policy rather than any case-by-case judgment, and that this framework had been operating across the luxury car sector for years without serious challenge. He went public with his frustration and delivered a line that landed precisely. "Bugatti," he said, "the customer service hasn't been as fast as the cars. It sounds casual until you consider how sharply it cut. Bugatti's entire identity is built on being the best at everything, and having their customer relations described as the one thing that doesn't meet the standard in front of millions of viewers was an observation that does not disappear quietly." The team made the same decision they had made with the Chiron. They would fabricate what they needed, source through third parties, and build around Bugatti's wall rather than through it, because waiting for Bugatti's cooperation was clearly never going to be a viable strategy, and Armstrong had already proven once that the wall was not as solid as the manufacturer wanted people to believe. He had now been refused by Bugatti twice, across two different cars, under two different sets of circumstances, and the pattern was impossible to ignore, which meant the question hanging over everything was no longer whether Armstrong would finish his builds, because nobody seriously doubted that anymore, but whether Bugatti's policy of total control could survive what was already moving toward them from Brussels, and whether the law that Europe had been quietly building was finally sharp enough to cut through the kind of corporate wall that had been stopping people like Mat Armstrong for years. Bugatti's deadline and why. July 2026 changes everything. Here is where everything that Mat Armstrong fought for, every refused phone call, every fabricated part, every wall Bugatti built around their cars, collides with something Bugatti cannot lobby against, cannot outspend, and cannot simply ignore European law. On the 13th of June, 2024, the European Union formally adopted Directive 2024/1799, the Right to Repair Directive, and the clock it started ticking has one very specific end date, the 31st of July, 2026. That is the date by which every EU member state must have written this directive into national law, and from that moment forward, manufacturers who use technical barriers, locked parts networks, or proprietary systems to prevent independent repairs will be operating in direct conflict with enforceable European legislation. Germany was already moving in January 2026, drafting national legislation that explicitly required manufacturers to make spare parts and repair information available to independent repairers at fair prices and within reasonable timeframes. France, where Bugatti's factory sits in Molsheim, was working through its own transposition process on the same deadline, meaning the country that houses Bugatti's headquarters would soon be legally obligated to hold Bugatti accountable to principles that directly contradict the policy they had applied to Mat Armstrong not once, but twice. Now, there is an important nuance here that deserves to be honest about. The directive's current Annex 2, the specific product list that carries the hardest legal obligations, covers household appliances, smartphones, and similar consumer goods rather than luxury vehicles specifically, which means Bugatti's legal team would argue, and would not be entirely wrong to argue, that the directive does not yet land squarely on hypercars in its current form. But that argument is narrower than it sounds, because the directive's broader principles on technical barriers and parts access are already reshaping how regulators across Europe view the entire manufacturing sector, and the automotive industry is firmly within their sights for the next phase of expansion. Mat Armstrong never set out to change European consumer law. He set out to fix a crashed Bugatti in Miami because that is what he does. But the story he created, documented in real time, watched by tens of millions of people, handed regulators the most compelling public argument they could have asked for, and Bugatti's July 2026 deadline is now arriving whether they are ready for it or not. Mat Armstrong did not win because Bugatti changed its mind. He won because he never stopped, and because the world was watching every single step of it. 2 Bugattis, 2 rejections. One mechanic refused to accept that owning something meant nothing, and now a continent full of lawmakers who agree with him. The 31st of July 2026 is not just a deadline on a Brussels calendar. For every manufacturer who has ever locked a VIN, blocked a parts request, or told an owner that their car was no longer theirs to fix, it is a reckoning. If this story hit differently for you, drop a comment below and tell us where you stand. And if you're new here, subscribe because we are just getting started.